Thank you, Pastor, for inviting me to share my sermon today, which I've titled The Foundation of the Christian Community. I'll be speaking on Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. As we go through life, we take on different identities. We begin our lives as children and grandchildren. As we become adults, many of us become spouses and parents. We also take on identities at school, work, and in the community. For example, as a child, I was nicknamed Four Eyes because I wore glasses. Today at work, my students call me Professor Coffman. At church, I'm La Pastora, pastor's wife, or Ms. Janet. Our scripture for today is about Jesus' identity and our identity as Christians. At the beginning of the passage, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" The disciples reply, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." The disciples' response shows that the people hold Jesus in high regard, equating him with some of the most famous prophets in Jewish tradition. Then Jesus asked the disciples, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter pipes up before anyone else can answer. He's like that little kid who always has the answer. Ooh, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Simon Peter recognizes that Jesus is more than just another in the long line of prophets who have come before him. He is the Messiah, the Son that God sent to establish his kingdom on earth. Jesus tells Simon Peter that he is blessed because God in heaven has revealed Jesus' identity to him. And Matthew, in this passage, uses the Greek word apocalypto, which connotes the divine disclosure of an eschatological secret. Simon Peter didn't turn to priests, scribes, or other religious authorities to tell him who Jesus is. He didn't learn as we do today by reading books, surfing the internet, or watching YouTube videos of sermons. Instead, he opened his heart so that God could reveal his truth to him. Certain that Simon Peter knows who he really is, Jesus goes on to tell Simon Peter who he really is. Jesus tells Simon Peter that he is the rock on which he will build his church, and that his church will be so strong that the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Jesus also says that he will give Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and that whatever Peter binds on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever Peter looses on earth will be loosed in heaven. Peter's role as the holder of the keys to the kingdom of heaven is that of a leader and a teacher. And this is evidence in Jesus' use of the words for binding and loosing, which is rabbinic terminology for the authority to interpret the Torah, the Jewish scripture, and to apply the Torah to determine what is and is not permitted under Jewish law. Catholics and Protestants interpret this passage differently. Catholic religious leaders have used this passage to support the founding of the papacy. In their view, the passage indicates that Jesus gave Peter a special role as the leader of the church, a role that the popes have carried forward through the centuries. Protestants disagree with this interpretation, pointing out that in the Aramaic language that Jesus and his disciples spoke, Cephas, the word from which Peter is derived, means rock. And this word for rock was not used as a proper name among the Jews of Jesus' times. Some scholars assert that the sentence, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," should be translated as, "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church." Protestants agree with Catholics that Peter played a unique role in the founding of the church, but they do not believe that he had any special insight or knowledge that God cannot reveal to others. The Protestant interpretation places more emphasis on Peter as a representative of all of the disciples, and by extension, all believers, all of whom form the foundation or pillars on which Jesus builds his church. This interpretation is consistent with Matthew chapter 18, verse 18, in which Jesus tells all of the disciples that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And this suggests that this is a characteristic is true of all the disciples, not just Peter. But let's ponder for a minute Jesus' choice of Peter to be the representative of the disciples, to be the foundation on which he will build his church. Remember that several weeks ago, when we read about Peter, he was the disciple who almost drowns as he attempts to walk toward Jesus on the water. He is the disciple who will go on to deny Jesus 3 times before the crucifixion. How could Jesus choose someone of such little faith and conviction to represent the cornerstone of his ministry on earth, to be that cornerstone? Peter was not a perfect disciple. And if we're honest, neither are we. All of us have weaknesses. Sometimes we're impatient, impulsive, intolerant, or unkind. Sometimes we turn to drugs and alcohol to escape from our problems. Sometimes we get so wrapped up in making money or spending money that we lose sight of what God calls us to do. But God does not lose sight of us. He is always ready to use us to fulfill his purpose, if we're willing. Some years ago, I visited San Salvador, the capital city of El Salvador. I went to the city's main cathedral, which contained a memorial to Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was assassinated in 1980 for speaking out against the poverty, injustice, and violence that plagued his country. Well, there I learned that Archbishop Romero had not always been an advocate for justice. Earlier in his career, he'd been a conservative who the country's progressive priests regarded with suspicion. Archbishop Romero's perspective changed after he was sent to serve as a bishop in a rural area of El Salvador and witnessed the brutality with which the landowners treated the peasants. He challenged Pope John Paul II to condemn the right-wing government in El Salvador for its violations of human rights and support of death squads, but the Pope refused his request. At first, I was disappointed to learn that Archbishop Romero had not fought against injustice from the beginning of his career, in the same way that the German Protestant theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood up to the Nazis, and the South African Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu challenged apartheid, in the same way that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. fought for civil rights since he was a young man. Then it struck me what mattered was not that Archbishop Romero was a flawed human being. What mattered was that God used him despite his flaws. God did not cast him out because he did not immediately do what God required of him. God worked on him patiently and steadfastly until he could recognize the suffering of the poor people in his country and speak out against it. God can and does work the same way in our lives. We may not be leaders of the church or secular institutions, but God nonetheless gives us many opportunities to be in solidarity with the poor, the dispossessed, and the marginalized among us. Today and every day, let us commit to living our lives in such a way that God will reveal his kingdom to us and show us how we can serve others. Let our motto be the African American spiritual that says, I'm going to live, I'm going to work, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to sing so that God can use me anywhere, Lord, anytime, anywhere, Lord, anytime.